All right, hello there. Welcome back to my channel. I wanted to do a review here today for The Earth is Weeping by Peter Cozzens, which is a book about the Indian Wars. And I did have a conversation with Stephen Heiner over on his channel. My internet crashed several times. I was worried that was going to happen because I have an unstable internet connection where I live. That's why I've never done a live stream. So that was my first attempt at doing a live stream, and it kind of worked out the way I was afraid it was going to happen. But I will link that conversation below in the description box if you want to watch it. But yeah, I kind of wanted to give the book a review proper, just talk about my thoughts and feelings on it and the things I like and the things I didn't like. Okay? So first up front, do I recommend the book? I'll just tell you up front, the book is a recommend for me. It covers basically a period of 30 to 40 years, kind of just like the 1860s to the 1890, 1891, all right, that kind of time frame, which is really the end of the Indian Wars. So it's kind of like the very tail end, the last bit, because the Indian Wars had been going on essentially since Columbus came to the New World. All right, so you're talking like 1492 up to 1890, 1891-ish, that time frame. So this book is really only dealing with like 1866 to the Wounded Knee Massacre. So if you want a fuller picture of the entirety of the conflict, you're going to have to read other material. Now, Cozzens does have a couple of books he has put out since, so he kind of has like a trilogy, if you will. This was the first book that he wrote. He has, since the publication of this book, written a book on Tecumseh. I think it's called Tecumseh and the Prophet, which is about Tecumseh and his brother. Kind of the time frame for that, in case you're wondering, like Tecumseh died at the Battle of Tippecanoe during the War of 1812. Tecumseh had allied himself with the British. So there's a book on that. And then he's also written, Cozzens wrote a book on the Creek Indian War. Andrew Jackson and his war against the Creek Indians. Again, it's around the same time period, but kind of deals with that. I think the Seminole Wars and then the expulsion of like the 5 civilized tribes west of the Mississippi because of the Indian Removal Act of 1830. These tribes are relocated. We're talking about the Creek, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and the Seminole tribes. Now, they were relocated out west into Indian territory, specifically, I think, into the area that is now modern-day Oklahoma. So, like I said, that book, Peter Cozzens' book, The Earth is Weeping, does not cover really those topics, that broader subject. If you really wanted to delve into it, somebody would have to write like a massive, I don't know, like 3-volume set on the Indian Wars. And they'd each be like 1,000 pages each. If you're talking about like the Spanish conquest of Central and South America, up into the Mexico area, Arizona, New Mexico, California, Florida. You're dealing with like the French coming in, like New France, the British colonizing. The Russians even had like a colony up in Russian America, what is now Alaska. The Dutch were here. That's New York was a Dutch colony, you know, like Newfoundland and stuff. So there was a lot going on. And this book is really just dealing with that little slice of the 40 years at the end. So it's very good, but it's not comprehensive. That's one of the drawbacks of it. The other thing is that the book, it gives a very detailed account of like the military history, the battles between the American Indians and the U.S. cavalry and settlers, but it doesn't go a whole lot into like the religious spirituality of the Indian tribes. It touches on it a little bit, but not a lot. And it doesn't really talk about like tribal structure all that much, as far as like forms of government and everything. Which again, he's trying to cover like 40 years worth of material in 400, it's under 500 pages. It's like 460 to 470 pages of material. So kind of limited. It's kind of one of the complaints is the over focus on military history. But I do give him a pass on that because he was writing this book as a response to Dee Brown's book, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, which was published in 1970. And that's kind of how Dee Brown's book is structured. So Cozzens is like really structuring his book as a mirror or a foil to Dee Brown's work. So my advice to you would be read them together. Read them both. I think you should read both books. If you read The Earth is Weeping, you should read Dee Brown's book, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, and vice versa. Gives you kind of a more well-rounded, kind of fuller picture of things. I think taking those two works together is probably ideal. Probably the ideal way to read The Earth is Weeping. So I give both of those books a recommendation, but just be aware that neither one of them is perfect. They both have gaps in the narrative. I will say that Dee Brown's book has a little bit more material on the front end that's more in depth. Specifically, Dee Brown talks about the Navajo, kind of like the Navajo Indians, which Cozzens doesn't really touch on a whole lot. And then Dee Brown goes into more depth on Little Crow and kind of the uprising that took place in Minnesota by the Dakota Sioux, also known as the Santee Sioux. So this is one of the things that can be confusing to people, is that when you're talking about the Sioux Nation, they are subdivided into like 3 different tribes. You've got the Lakota, which are probably the most famous, which the Lakota are divided into 7 bands. So you have, like, for instance, in these 7 bands, like the Brule, the Minikanju, the Oglala. I don't remember the name of all of them, but you know, they're definitely the most famous of the 3. The Nakota are probably the lesser known. And then these tribes, the Dakota and the Nakota, or excuse me, the Lakota and the Nakota dwelt on the Great Plains region. It's kind of that big strip, you know, that goes like from up in Montana and the Dakotas all the way down into Texas. Although once you're down like in Texas, that's mostly Comanche and Apache down there, like the Arizona, New Mexico, Texas region. So you have to kind of like get out like a map. There are several maps in Peter Cozzens' book, which are very helpful. So that's a plus, but you're talking about like the Santee Sioux uprising or the Dakota uprising in 1862. Cozzens' book really just kind of has like the Cliff Notes blurb version. It's like one paragraph. It's pretty short. Whereas D. Brown has like a whole chapter dedicated to it. I do kind of consider that like kind of the start of the period that we're talking about as far as like the Indian Wars for the West, because I think that event was kind of like I don't want to say it was like the 9/11 of the whole conflict, but it kind of, if you look at it that way, it kind of is, because the Sand Creek Massacre takes place after this, and I think that Sand Creek was triggered in a way by this Dakota uprising that took place in Minnesota, where Little Crow led the Sioux in kind of like a 5-week reign of terror. Literally went on for 5 weeks. There were a crop failure in 1861, and game was scarce, and the Dakota Sioux went to the agency to get their food, and they were told there isn't anything. This is 1862. They were told by the Indian agent there that they could either eat grass or eat their own dung. Well, that didn't go over too well. Some braves were out foraging. They came across a farmer's property and came across some eggs. One of the braves was going to take the eggs, and the other one said, "Don't take it. It belongs to a white man." Essentially, thought he was being accused of cowardice, so he decided he was just going to kill the family that lived on this farm. So they did. They murdered these people, including a woman and a teenage girl who at the time was holding a baby. They went back to their tribal leaders and told them what they had done. The tribal leaders were like, "Oh no, we got to take this to Little Crow." And Little Crow essentially knew that like soldiers were going to come down and punish the Sioux for this slaughter. And he just decided, I guess we're just going to rise up and kill first. Like, we're just going to go to war, knowing even that they didn't have a chance. But during that 5-week reign of terror, you have to understand that this is in the midst of the American Civil War. This is in 1862. This event is taking place basically on August 17th. You're thinking about concurrently events that are running with this. We're right around the Second Battle of Bull Run, close to that. And they go nuts. They attack the upper and lower Indian agencies in Minnesota. They go on a rampage, just raiding farms, killing settlers. They attacked Fort Ridgely. They attacked a town called, I think it was called New Ulm. Over 600 whites were killed. They also took like over 300 people, mainly women and children, captive. And the rebellion of this Indian uprising really didn't get put down until John Pope lost the Second Battle of Bull Run out there and was sent west to Minnesota District, and he sent out Sibley and some Union troops to put the thing down. That ended it. But all the chaos of the American Civil War going on out east, like, kind of slowed down the response to this. Everybody's tied up out there. So, yeah, this was kind of like, I think, the event that really got into people's psyche. This like, remember the Dakota uprising? And people just were traumatized by it. Scared them. It was like the boogeyman. So I guess in some ways, like fear, fear is very powerful. And it's a very powerful motivating factor in the way that people behave. They're scared and they don't trust. And I think it was on both sides. What reading these books shows me is that there was just a lot of fear and distrust. And rightly so, I think, in a lot of cases. But anyways, both of these books are a recommendation for me to you. I think you should read them both. I'm not going to go on anymore and talk about it. I could probably talk for an hour or more on this subject, but really don't feel like it. So anyways, thank you for watching. Have a wonderful day.